Okay, welcome to Healthcast number 1. So this is on human biomechanics. So I am not a classically trained university biomechanics teacher, so I'm not going to be talking about the physics side of things. I wish I did know all the physics side of things, but I'm going to break things down in biomechanics to something that can be understood in layman's terms. So we're going to break it down into 10 key aspects. So that's what this video is all about. I'll just do a quick summary on all of those 10 key aspects. So starting off at number 1, I'm going to be talking about the human biomechanical ideal. So the human biomechanical ideal is the notion that we have an ideal way of moving, even though we are different from each other. But we're the same species and we have an ideal way of moving, and the more you train for that ideal way of moving, the less pain you'll be in, the more efficiently you'll move, the better you'll perform, etc., etc. Then the next topic is posture. This links to the human biomechanical ideal, because to move ideally you have to have an ideal posture to do it. Next one will be alignment, which again is closely tied to posture. Symmetry, again closely tied to posture. Weight transference. Sequencing is the next one. So what do I mean by sequencing? So that it just means really your body moves as an integrated unit. So what is the sequence of that moving? So from the very basics, as your right arm comes forward, your left leg comes forward. And so there should be a timing to that movement as your leg and your arm come forward. If the leg comes forward a little bit before the arm, you're not connecting up in the way you should do, and you won't move as efficiently. So it's kind of, you can also, I suppose, say sequencing and timing for that one. The next one is tensegrity. I'll explain that later, but tensegrity is all about kind of a tension, really. It's a really difficult concept to explain to people. I find this difficult, so I need my daughter's little tensegrity toy to help me out here. So tensegrity is the tension basically here in the little elastic bands or strings is holding the structure together, and you've got a sort of similar but much more complicated thing going on inside your body. It's the tension between all the muscles, ligaments, tendons and fascia all working together that holds your body up into a structure. It's not the bones that are holding you up. The bones are kind of floating, a bit like these struts here, in a mesh of muscle and fascia and everything else. That's what's keeping you up. You are a tensegrity structure. I'll explain more in a minute. Then we've got decompression. So decompression, what do I mean by that? Very briefly, think someone with bad posture, they're hunched over like this, they're almost compressed, they're like compressed against the force of gravity. And one of the big problems you get if you've got bad posture is you get compression on your intervertebral discs, and they start to break down as you age. And that's caused by the constant compression of basically daily life, the effect of gravity on you. So decompression is obviously to kind of decompress your tissues so that you aren't putting so much force on your joints or certain muscle groups. And then number 9 is priming. So priming would be a bit like loading a bow and arrow. So before you shoot the arrow, you'll pull back the bowstring. That's kind of priming it, that's lengthening the string, creating some elastic potential energy, and then you let it go, bam. The similar thing happens with your muscles, so I won't go any further than that at the moment. And then the last one, I put more as a question mark here on the screen, is imperfection. So what I mean by imperfection is that if you were to move in the absolute ideal way all the time, you may not be able to react to certain circumstances that come your way. So imagine that you get in a fight or wrestle with someone and you've been moving in the exact perfect way all the time. You're not prepared to adjust into some strange ranges of motion that you have to react to the whole time. So, and another one I can think of is maybe like a trail run, for example, where So if you're running on concrete and you're running with the perfect running technique, your feet are always hitting the exact same spot. You've got it all under control. When you're on a trail run, there's rocks, mud, you're going to slip occasionally, you're going to turn your ankle a little occasionally, and your musculo-fascial system needs to react to all these tiny little bits of feedback. So that would be my other one. I'm going to sneak another one on the end, just like a bonus one, number 11, which is going to be the equation, and I'll explain the equation later. So this equation will be how you improve things, or how you stop getting worse. So those are the 10/11 concepts involved in good human biomechanics. So let's get going with number 1, the human biomechanical ideal. The training of biomechanics really needs to be based in evolutionary theory. Now, humans are fairly unique, both when it comes to the way we move and our ability to compensate in the way we move. So if you think of a solitary animal like a big predator, like a bear or a cat, let's say a cheetah would be a good example. Now, if a cheetah pulls a muscle, breaks a leg, tears a ligament, they're pretty much done for. They need their ability to run at speed, to hunt, and they're generally fairly solitary creatures. They don't tend to work in packs, although sometimes they'll work with other cheetahs, but it's rare. And even then, the other cheetahs aren't going to help them out if they get injured. They're not going to take care of them, look after them, bring them food, things like that. You see some similar things happening in wolf packs, for example, but it's rare. It's rare in the animal kingdom. You see this also with horses. If a horse breaks its leg, the horse is dead. Basically, it's gone. It's not going to adapt to that broken leg. It needs it to function. It's going to be picked off by a predator if it's in the wild. There's no getting away from it. Humans are very different. If we pick up a slight injury, a muscle tear, a pull, a broken bone, and as long as it's not fatally serious, like breaking your spine or your skull or cracking your skull, you're going to get looked after. And very long ago in human history, humans have always been Homo sapiens have been a social animal and have always lived in groups, small groups or tribes. So if you got injured, you'd be looked after and you can heal. So we have found the ability to really adapt to injury, to stresses and strains, possibly as much as any animal, maybe apart from some sort of amphibians and things that can grow limbs back, for example. But we don't have that ability, but we have the ability to compensate for injuries that have occurred in accidents, different lifestyles. We fill almost any niche that we can, so we're like super adaptable. This is fantastic. We've become definitely the most successful species on Earth, but it has some problems when you start taking sort of hunter-gatherer man, which is what we've evolved to be. Humans have been around, Homo sapiens have been around 150,000 to 250,000 years. Some of our next ancestors, like Homo erectus and below, longer than that. But let's just say we've been around 150 to 250,000 years. In that time, we have been hunter-gatherers most of that time, and then maybe 20,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, something like that, we've started to become agriculturalists, and then maybe even only a couple of hundred years ago, industrialists, and then now we're in the technological age and things are changing again. So in the last few hundred years, a lot has happened, and even if you go back to agricultural times, 20,000 years is only a small proportion of that time. So our bodies aren't particularly well adapted to our lifestyles anymore. So we live to ripe old ages now. We don't get picked off by predators. we don't get picked off by disease so much, so we tend to develop some more minor problems, you could say. We survive, but we survive with ailments, usually chronic ailments, and that seems to be the health problem of the present day, is chronic ailments. So, ideally, by the way, if you want to look into this kind of theory about how things have changed and how we are now having to adapt to ever more increasingly new stimuli, and it's kind of overloading our system, you can have a look at Brett and Heather Weinstein's book, which is new book, which is Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. This is very good at explaining how about the mismatch between how we've evolved to be and what we are now, and how we can reconcile those two things. Some of it involves human biology, some of it involves psychology. Have a look yourself, I recommend it. But anyway, talking about the ideal then. So we're going to start with posture. Now, I did a postural video a little while ago explaining what the ideal standing posture is. I'll just summarize it very quickly here, so bear with me a moment. So perfect posture is best to look at it from side on. So if you get this posture right from side on, you'll tend to get it right from front on. But ideally, from side on, I'll just try and demonstrate it the best I can here. So we're going to have shoulders up, back. I won't go through the cueing process, I've done that on other videos. But something like that would be a very, very good posture for most people. And so what are we looking for in that posture? So we're looking for good stacking, basically. So good stacking in the posture. So am I lining up head to toe without sort of doing stuff like this or like this? Could I run a straight line through the top of my head down to kind of the mid part of my foot, middle or back of my foot? That means that I'm protected against gravity as best as possible. This is pretty obviously true. You don't have to be a physicist to work this out, or a physician to do it. So obviously, if you've got your hips are forward and your shoulders are back and gravity is working on you like this, you're going to put strain much more on certain areas of the body than if you have a good posture and you're nice and straight. It'll be supported by the whole body. Now obviously from side on or from front on, it's not just an alignment in that way, it's also going to be some form of symmetry. You don't want to be lopsided on one side, for example, as I am a little bit on my right side. But if you can get some symmetry, you're going to be a lot better off. Again, everything's going to be supported. You're not going to find gravity's working on one particular side more than the other and compressing parts of your body and maybe overstretching other parts of the body. It just makes sense from an obvious standpoint. It's pretty obvious that you want to be symmetrical from front on and good alignment from side on. Okay, so that kind of covers quickly about the posture side of it. I'll get into that a little bit more. And then we've got the movement side of things. So humans are differentiated from other animals in many ways. We're obviously more intelligent, but our biomechanics is quite different to almost any other animal. There are not many animals that walk on two legs, and even if there are, they're often totally different in other ways as well. Like an ostrich, for example, walks on two legs, but it doesn't have arms. It only has little stunted wings. It doesn't really use very much. So, what do we want? So with good posture then, the idea is that our legs will move this way. Let's say I'm walking towards the camera here. My legs I want to move in a straight line going forwards, and my arms are going to reciprocate. So we call that contralateral reciprocation, and that's the idea. Just that simple reciprocation of arms and legs. Now, obviously, going into alignment now slightly, you don't want to be walking and then your knees pointing in as you walk. And obviously you see this with some people, they'll walk and their knees will buckle in like that. And other people might walk and their hips might do stuff like this. So you want to have your legs moving about hip width apart, pretty much straight like that. Now, your upper body does something a little bit different. So your arms, if you're walking or running in a straight line, they obviously want to be going in a straight line. There's not much point in bringing your arms across your body if you're going to move that way, because you're losing energy out to the side. So it's the same with the hip shifts or the knees or the ankles. You sometimes see people just pushing up their ankles, and they'll do some strange things with their ankles as well. But you don't want to lose energy either way, this way. You want the energy to be flowing forwards when you run, if you're running forwards. And then you want, obviously, there's some adjustments when you're going into different directions as you move. But it just doesn't make sense on a performance level for you to lose all this energy out to the side. And evolution, if there's one thing that it tends to get out of a species, it's inefficiency. Because obviously inefficient animals, they don't tend to survive very long. So that's what we've got. We've got a pretty efficient system. Now, our arms don't just go up and down, and our legs go up and down like that. We actually use our torso and rotate ever so slightly as we walk and run. So we rotate as we walk. Now, this is partly because our torso creates length with our muscle and fascia, and it connects the upper body to the lower body, and it creates this kind of length tension relationship. So when I'm here, I've got more length as I turn my torso to this side. So this is helping bring my other leg through in my gait cycle, basically. Also, there is this ability to laterally flex. You'll see this, say if I throw a ball like that. So I throw a ball towards the camera, I'm actually rotating my torso, but I'm also laterally flexing my spine, because I'm going to try and create leverage and length, and then contract off that length. So that's number 9 on there. So the length, the priming one, which is lengthen and contract, lengthen and contract. We'll explain a bit more about that later. And then the symmetry is pretty obvious. You don't want to have, again, one foot poking out this way, one foot going that way as you walk. And I see this quite a lot. You want that symmetry. And remember, we are evolved animals. We would have shared ancestors with fish. So maybe you don't think symmetry is very important for a human being. They can be slightly off and get away with it. But let's say you're a fish. You want it to be symmetry, because as you go through the water, you're going to have the best hope of being able to be streamlined. And it's the same with other animals too. Symmetry is really desirable in the animal kingdom, which is why you tend to be more attracted to symmetrical faces and things like that. So there's a lot that goes into it, but that's it. Basically, in a nutshell, your legs should be driving forward if you're going to walk or run in a straight line, and your upper torso is rocking, but your arms are going forward and back like that. Okay? So it's going side to side, and a little bit of lateral flexion as well. And all of that is to create this length, to prime your body to move off of. And so that's in walking and running. Obviously, human beings stand, walk, run, and throw. That's where we're quite different from other animals. We will throw things. Capuchin monkeys throw poo at you occasionally, but we throw quite a lot, and we also swing things. So when I say throw, it's not only about throwing balls or spears, things like that, but also about throwing punches as well, or throwing kicks. And it could be things like swinging swords, swinging axes, hammers, and you see this all the time actually. So in our sport, you'll see people kicking balls, throwing balls, swinging a bat, and it's all the way that we create force in these sporting events and in things like hunting or fighting is always through rotation. It's rotation, and it always tends to be kind of opposing sides. So as you throw a punch, it's going to be like that. So it's the opposing side. So you might ask the question then, why is it that when we go to the gym, you see everyone doing pull-ups, bench presses, squats, and so there's hardly any of this this contralateral reciprocation going on in people's gym training. And so if you were to train with me, I don't solely focus on these things. It is important to do some bilateral work, like squats, for example, but I would say the majority of the moves are going to be unilateral or contralateral in their nature. So that's the biomechanical ideal in a nutshell. Now, why do we move like that? So obviously, as I've just mentioned, it is essentially about performance. The better you move, the more efficiently that you move, the better your chances are of going to be able to get away from that predator, to be able to hunt down that animal, to avoid injury, all of these things. So performance and injury prevention are very much linked. They're the same kind of thing, really. The more efficient you move, less chance of injury. Okay. So let's move into posture in a little bit more detail. People tend to think posture is all about the way you stand, just still in one position. Posture is important through a range of different motions and all the way through every movement you ever make. So it's not enough to be able to just control good standing posture. And this is some of the problem that I see in the scientific literature when it comes to relating posture with injury. So firstly, I'm not sure that they really have a great definition of what good posture is. So you might look at someone generally and think their posture's not bad, and you might look at somebody else and think their posture's really bad. And the difference is pretty obvious in severity sometimes. It's pretty obvious to see when someone's got bad posture. But sometimes it's not obvious to see how well someone's going to move based on their posture. And the reason for that is that you can be in a really good standing position in your posture, but then as soon as you move, you can lose the ability to find a neutral spine, for example. So classic example of this would be in a squat, for example. Let's just demonstrate a squat for you. Squat on the chair. So I'm going to try and do the perfect squat for you first off. So with good posture, I'm going to try and maintain this neutral spine. So I have neutral spine is the best I can manage it at the moment, and I'm just going to try and maintain that as I squat down. And then as I come up again. Now, generally I do that with a mirror in front so I can just check what's going on in my spine. Now what you tend to see when people squat is something like this actually. So in this standing position, at the moment I've got quite a strong posterior tilt of my pelvis to give myself a neutral spine. Now let's hold that posterior tilt. Let's not adjust my spine at all as I go down. Now, obviously you can see a problem. I've lost the neutral spine as I've gone down, I've rounded in the back, I've put some compressive forces in places that they shouldn't be. Now let's stand up. So let's say I'm in a good neutral spine position here sitting down. I've adjusted my spine pretty well, and I'm going to stand up, and now I'm not going to move it at all as I come up. So I'm not going to adjust at all. So I'll try not to adjust to show you. And so I'm going to pull my shirt, and now you can see I'm in a bit of an anterior tilt of my pelvis because I've not adjusted my spine as I've come up. That's an example of good sequencing, by the way, to be able to actually adjust as you're moving and keep that neutral spine and not just adjust at the start and adjust at the finish is an example of good sequencing. So if you can sequence that movement and keep the neutral spine as you take it through different ranges of motion, that's great, and it's usually very good for your body. Now, if you don't, and I find this with a lot of people, and particularly people who are very, very flexible, and this is something that functional patterns have noted as well, that when you train someone that's done a lot of yoga, for example, they'll have trouble adjusting their posture through different ranges of motion. And a part of another problem with yoga is that they are going through some quite big ranges of motion in yoga, so they're going through some quite crazy positions sometimes. It doesn't tend to relate so much to people just doing beginner style yoga, but once you get to a fairly high level of yoga practitioner, or someone who's really into yoga, been doing it for years, they're going through some big ranges of motion in a very often in static positions, and then they're not really that focused on what's going on with their posture while they're doing it. They may think they are, but I can assure you that they're not. And this starts to become a problem, quite a big problem, and it makes my life quite difficult as someone who's trying to train you to get back in the right positions. Sometimes people with really bad posture will actually feel where the right position is a lot better. A good example of this is in your typical bad postural position, so I'll explain. So we've got a bad postural position. I'll just try and demonstrate this. So the typical bad postural position people have is a bit of an anterior tilt here in their lower back, and then a bit of a shift, and then that tends to encourage this rounding of the upper spine as well. So that would kind of be a bad postural position. Now, when you correct someone and put them in a good standing postural position, what do? So you pull the shoulders up and back, you get them into that kind of anterior tilted position, and then posterior tilt out of there, and then they neutralise the spine. So what I tend to find is that these people tend to be fairly fused in this position, and it can be difficult for them to get this. What tends to happen is that they'll put the shoulders back. Maybe they can manage that, maybe not. But if they do, what tends to happen is that they'll get the anterior tilt, and then if they can actually posterior tilt, they posterior tilt and over and go their shoulders again. But it's possible, and with a bit of training, especially with a bit of myofascial release, it's possible to get them to do this. And if they can, what they'll feel is that they'll feel a big, they'll feel some strain between their shoulder blades and some core engagement, because their body wants them to go in this position. They're pulling back here, so they're almost working against their own internal resistance bands here at the hip. The hip flexors are usually short and overactive, and then they're also working against often their shortened pecs here to bring their shoulders back in this position. So they're working against like two different sets of resistance bands when they do it. Now, the problem with overly flexible people is that you might see an overly flexible person and they might stand like this, and you think there's not too much wrong with their posture. And then if you correct it, they'll go bump, bump, and they won't feel any tension there. They won't feel the connection between these areas, because they've got into some of these funny positions doing yoga where they've done a bridge like this, and they're just so hyper flexible in this area that nothing really is easily connected up. Okay, so before I get into the problem I have with quite flexible people, very flexible people, or people who do yoga, I'm just going to explain why putting yourself in a really good postural position, and what I mean by that really is most fundamentally finding a neutral spine. So if you can find a neutral spine in your posture, you're going to start being able to integrate different areas of your body much better. To explain this, I'm going to have to talk about the myofascial lines. So there are quite a few myofascial lines, and this was a concept first figured out by Thomas Myers, who put it into a book called Anatomy Trains. So the problem with perhaps Western culture in general is that it's a strength and also a weakness, is that we tend to be really good categorizers. So we've broken things down into their constituent parts. It's why you tend to get kind of a lot of woolly thinking Western people who are very attracted to Eastern thought, because they talk about oneness and the wholeness of things. You might notice that Eastern people tend to think of like a wholeness of a concept, or the group being the most important thing, whereas Westerners are very much the individual, so the focus is on the individual. So in that respect, we've learned to create the science, because science is basically a concept of categorizing different things, breaking it down, and then studying the individual units. So we're very good at breaking things down. When it comes to the human body, we think of biceps and triceps, quads, abs, pecs, and all this thing. And when people train, you can see them. They're going to have a shoulders and pecs day, they're going to have a legs day, etc., etc. But it's really the wrong way of thinking about optimal, efficient human biomechanics. We should be thinking about the body as a whole. That said, it's pretty complicated to think of the whole body, to think of it like that. There's a lot of things going on, and so it is necessary to break it down a little bit. But what I'm going to do is break it down into what we call myofascial lines. So these are basically kinetic chains where you can actually dissect out the link between muscles through the body. Now, in anatomy trains, I think there are maybe 8, 9, possibly 10 different myofascial lines. They go from superficial and deep to lateral, spiral, frontal, all this sort of thing. So I'm going to simplify it a little bit more into basically 4 sets of myofascial lines, and I want you to think about it as front line. And if I just demonstrate this standing up, if you think about the front line, we're thinking this part from the top of the head down to the feet. So you could think of that as basically the front line. Then we've got the back line, so basically from the heels up to the top of the head. Then we've got the lateral lines, so these are lateral lines going right down the side here, and then the spiral lines which go across the body like that, so across the body like that, and kind of vice versa at the back. So that's how I want you to think of it. So front line, back line, lateral lines, spiral lines. So think of it like that. Now, when your posture is in really good order, you start integrating these lines well. What do I really mean by that? Well, I gave the example just now of like a squat, and then you're moving your body, and if you get the sequencing right, the alignment right, your posture's good, you should be able to feel the tension. You should be able to feel this lengthening of certain areas and shortening of certain areas. This is a really great advantage when you're doing exercise. I'll give an example. I think a really simple example is a slam, actually. So you see people in the gym slamming medicine balls or dead balls to the ground. Now, if you do this really well, and you've got good posture, you pick up the ball, and when you put it behind your head, if you've really got a good posterior tilt here, you're holding some good intra-abdominal pressure here, as you bring it behind your head, you should lengthen this front line. And so particularly if you then bend your knees forwards like this, so if we've got good posture, the ball goes behind the head, we're in this position here, you should feel a length coming through this front line. It makes sense, doesn't it? If you're not holding a good posture and you let that back hyperextend and you do that, I actually can feel some compression going on my lower back immediately doing that without any weight in my hands. So you can see that, you can actually feel that tension there. And that feeling of tension, that feeling of creating length, actually stops you from overdoing it. It stops you overdoing the range of motion. It gets you to just the right range of motion where your muscles are quite optimally lengthened, and then they're ready to slam down like that. Okay, so that's just one example about lengthening that front line. Now, imagine this same exercise with a really flexible person who can't get that tension, who doesn't feel much tension because they're so flexible, they can just go to ranges of motion without feeling it too much. So what I tend to find is that really flexible people that do yoga, for example, that they are able to take the ball behind the head. They may even be able to posterior tilt their pelvis a little bit, but they can't feel this tension, and so they often overdo the range of motion, putting harmful compression on their joints. So that's something to think about. So that actually covers kind of posture, alignment, even tensegrity, like we were talking about. So you get, if you're in good posture and you're able to adjust it through different ranges of motion, you maintain that tensegrity, that push, pull, shorten, lengthen kind of feeling all over your body, and you maintain that tension and you can feel it. It's a real thing. Once you start training the body this way, you can feel where your body should be. And then, you know, you're not perfect, and I'm certainly not perfect myself, but I look in the mirror and make sure that I'm right, and the more that I maintain that neutral spine throughout different ranges of movement, the better I can feel the tension in all these ranges of motion. So maintain a neutral spine and I rotate, I can feel the length. I know how far I'm supposed to go. And if I, again, maintain a neutral spine, I'm bending over to one side, I know how far I'm going to go the whole time. It gives excellent feedback, as well as obviously being optimal for good performance. Okay, so I'm going to try and link this in with some more of those concepts I was talking about. So we talk about symmetry here and weight transference. So again, if you're holding good postural positions, it should sort of naturally make you symmetrical in a static position. But also the concept of symmetry is important when you're moving as well. And that again ties in with kind of sequencing a little bit. So if we talk about sequencing a little bit here, we'll take the same example. So a slam. So if you're doing the slam again with good posture, bring the ball behind your head. You engage the posterior tilt, you've got good length through this region, and then you come down to the slam. You'll notice that everything kind of moves in a good sequencing pattern. So we're back here, and everything moves at the right timing, you could say. Parts of the body move at the right timing. And that tends to come with this finding of a good neutral spine, good posture, and things like that. Now, again, if you're off slightly with your posture, if you're not able to control the neutral spine through this movement, what you tend to find are things like this. So they'll go beyond that movement, and then it'll move in a kind of there'll be a mismatch between how the lower body moves and the upper body moves. You see this often with lunges as well. So if I was going to do a lunge, go down again, good posture. I'll try and do a good lunge for you. So I'll try and do a good lunge here. So we'll go down and just going forward. The push there going forward. What I tend to find with a lot of people though is if they can go down like this, they often are driven by the hip flexors and the quads and the lower back, and it will look something like this. So they'll come forward, and there'll be that mismatch, so they'll be leading too much of their hips. The timing and the sequencing of the movement won't be great. And then also you get the symmetry problem kind of in the way that they're moving their arms, so that the arm will come first, and then the other one won't move in the same kind of timing. The symmetry of the opposing movements will be off. So the sequencing, the symmetry and the alignment, they all kind of go together. Okay, moving on to decompression then. So what do I mean by decompression? So what you might see in a lot of people, particularly when they're older and their posture is particularly bad, you might see that they're kind of hunched over, and everything is kind of feels like it's almost compressed down. You can see it actually even in how their body looks. If you take the shirt off, everything kind of looks like it's kind of drooping down when you're older. It's got compressed over time and it's drooping down. Now, what's something you notice if you look at a young person's body, say like an 18 to 20-year-old man who's got some reasonable muscle definition, it'll all look kind of lifted in comparison. You have a look at, for example, Sylvester Stallone's early movies compared to his later movies, so the more recent Rambo movies and everything. Everything's kind of gone down. He's still quite impressively muscled for an older guy, but before he was up here, when he was doing the Rocky movies, his whole rib cage was lifted, and he looks kind of taller, holding himself better, and his body kind of just looks lifted. And that's just the act of compression. As he's got older, his posture's worsened, and that ability to act against gravity is being lost, and he's just going with gravity towards the ground. And then by the time it's 100, no doubt Sylvester Stallone will be a bit more bent over and a bit lower with everything else. So that's what I mean by decompression. So if you do the correct exercises, you hold your posture in good position, you do all these things, that length tension relationship that you create in all of these different planes of motion in your body actually helps lift, kind of almost like a force separating the joints a little bit rather than crushing them. So you can imagine if this timer here was my knee joint, like I'd be kind of crushing it in this position, and in the other position I'd be kind of separating it. If I've got a good length tension through the myofascial lines, I'll be able to lengthen the muscle and kind of take some pressure off that joint, because all of the pressure of your movement, or the impact on the ground, it should all be going through your myofascial system rather than onto the joints themselves. One concept I missed out there then is weight transference. So this is something that most people do extraordinarily badly once they start losing their postural position. And there's a good reason for it, because the posture affects so much of how you move that it starts to become an issue to be able to balance whilst shifting your weight from one foot to the other, for example, when you walk or run. Now, for example here, so when you run with good posture, you're basically there, you've shifted. Again, I haven't got much weight on this back foot, you've shifted over to this other foot. You notice I've just rotated a little bit to this side, but because when you have bad posture, when you rotate, you see how it's kind of difficult to shift the weight over. I've still got now too much weight on the other side, and now I'm trying to shift, my knees are then going to collapse inwards to shift the gravity on kind of right down the middle of my body, whereas when I'm holding good posture and I shift the weight to the other foot, because I've got this rotation in my upper body rather than my lower body, I'm able to keep that weight where it should be, and I can shift the weight properly. An exercise I often do at the start of my classes, for example, is just a weight shift exercise. So you put yourself in a good postural position, and then you just shift your weight onto the front of your feet, try and hold your posture, and then shift the weight back. So you just shift forward and back, and the whole body should stay as one here. But it's very rare that I get people to be able to do that. What I usually see is that some people will shift forward kind of with their upper body like that, and you can often see that with people running. You often see people running with a bit of a bent over upper torso. This happens a lot when people get older. And then the other one that I see is people leading with the hips, and this is quite common as well. So they'll be going that and back, that way maybe, and their hips are just all over the place. They might lead with their hips this way, or they might also try and lean back that way. And it's just all the hips, there's no real structural integration going on. And if you've got that good posture and you're holding a good posture, the weight shifts should then help you integrate and go evenly in each direction, so you're not putting too much strain on any particular joints or any particular areas. The other one is going side to side, so the same thing, but we're just going to move side to side. It's very subtle, just move your weight from one foot to another like that. It's not particularly easy to do for a lot of people. Again, you get the hip shifts this way and that. Obviously, if you think if you're playing a sport and you shift your weight to this hip and then you do that, you do it mainly with your hip, and then try and push off that leg, you're getting a lot of stress into your hip here. Again, if you try and shift your weight and you go this way, again, you're going to get some problems. If you can actually integrate your posture as you shift your weight, then you're gonna move much better and change direction a lot better. And so all of these things are linked. So, you know, if you have good posture, you tend to get good alignment. You've got good alignment and posture, your sequencing tends to be better. If your sequencing is good, you know, then your weight transference will be good, and then they all tie into each other. Good posture, good weight transference. If you transfer your weight well, you tend to hold a better postural position. They all kind of interlink in this really complicated way. So the last couple then, imperfection is next. So imperfection, you know, I briefly mentioned this, and there's not too much to it, but it's just the theory that if you are just focusing on moving perfectly all the time, and you don't have any external resistance working on you, then your adaptation to some slightly imperfect positions, say if you were in like a wrestling match or if you're running on a trail, wouldn't be so good, perhaps. That's why I put that in a question mark. So if you think you're running on a trail, you're constantly adapting to perhaps even missteps. You know, the better you are at trail running, the less missteps you'll do, but it's inevitable you're gonna land on your foot slightly wrong, or something's going to get in the way. You're going to slip on something, and so it's good to be able to have that adaptation in some different ranges of motion that isn't quite perfect. And so that's all that one was really about. Alright, so here's my little Tensegrity toy. So this is my daughter's toy that I bought for her but bought for me, if you know what I mean, at the same time. So forget about the little things dropping, that is just genuinely a toy, something to do with the toy. But this is what I would call a tensegrity structure. So it's a structure that is actually held up by the tension between on these strings here. And you can think of the human body as working in a similar way. So you can see when we move the structure, the whole structure moves as one, and it's being held up by the tension the whole time. Now if you injure a certain area, for example, let's say you tear a ligament here, and then, I don't know, maybe you get in a car crash or something, and then you also break a bone over here, and then one here. You can see what happens to the structure. It's now been warped out of sort of its recognisable shape, and it's not going to, when we then place it under tension, it's not going to react in quite the same way. And you can think of your body very much along the same lines. So you don't have to get in a car crash or have something really horrific happen to you. You could just, over the years of working at your desk, being stressed at your job, working long hours, gradually develop some stiffness maybe in your hip flexors, which then translates, because that's pulling over this side, to stiffness maybe in your shoulders and neck, and then that causes you to be warped out of all shape. And here we go, that's where bad posture happens. And so as you can see, once you get a problem crop up in one position, it tends to start pulling somewhere else, and then you get a problem crop up somewhere else, and then you get a problem crop up somewhere else, and then you get a problem crop up somewhere else. And then all of a sudden you're bent over, well, not all of a sudden, but by the time you're like 100, you're bent over in a really, really horrible, compromised position where your range of motion has completely changed, and you may be having some pain and injury along with it. And so that is what tensegrity is. And basically, in this structure, the tension between these areas is even. This is a pretty even tension between all areas, and that's a very basic tensegrity structure. Now with a human being, it's quite different. We are a very complex tensegrity structure, so you'd have areas where you have a bit more tension, and then it's just a super complex interplay of things going on. So you can imagine with the variation of lifestyles that people have, the variation in DNA that they have, the variation in jobs that they have, all of these things all play a part to giving you a very, very unique set of issues that you have to deal with, because very few of us are running around hunting for food and living the perfect biomechanical life of maybe some of our ancestors. And even then, as I've already mentioned, the perfect life as far as your biomechanics are concerned really has never happened. So that's what's going on. And so the perfect human biomechanical ideal is balance between all these areas. So let's just briefly talk a little bit about priming and the lengthening and shortening of muscles. So this is a super important aspect, and again, it's all tied in with everything else. So it's tied in with tensegrity, alignment, posture, sequencing. All of these things are tied in together. So if you've got good posture, if it tends to maintain a good level of tensegrity on your body, you can feel the lengthening and the shortening in certain areas. So what you should think is that when you move, the human body has evolved in such a way as to take advantage of physics, basically, and elasticity. So you can think of your muscles and fascia connecting through these myofascial lines, as I've just briefly mentioned, as a bit like a bowstring on a bow and arrow. So to launch the arrow, you have to pull back the bowstring, and then you create length on the bowstring, and that creates kind of this elastic potential energy, and then when you let it go, it shoots the arrow. Now your musculofacial system is not quite as elastic as a bowstring or an elastic band, but it does have some elastic potential. So it performs best when it's lengthened first. So if you think of a bicep curl or a bench press, for example, you're often going from a fairly neutral position, say in the bicep curl, to a shortened position. It's the same with the bench press as well. You're going from a kind of neutral position. If you're slightly rounded in the shoulders, they may already be in a shortened position, and then you're just going shorter as you push forward. So that's kind of the limitations of conventional weight training, is that you're really not training the myofascial system to lengthen and shorten, and you're getting quite isolated in how you're working out. Now the benefit of training in a more integrated fashion, when you're thinking about these myofascial lines and integrating them together, is that you can create this lengthening and shortening effect. So you create length, and then your muscles and fascia have got a little bit of elastic potential energy, and so then they rebound slightly. But you need the contraction as well. So they have this elastic potential energy, and then it's like contract. Whereas generally what you're doing is, in normal weight training, and if you're not moving well, full stop, is that you're just going to contract like that. You're not getting the length, you're not getting that snappy elastic kind of movement. And you'll notice this again with age. So young people in general tend to have this kind of bouncy way of moving. They move with a lot more elasticity, and then as you get older, you lose that elasticity. And that elasticity can be lost in a couple of different ways. Like I said, most people tend to get this chronic shortening all over their body, where they also become less flexible when it comes to movements generally and in their posture, and so that they get reduced ranges of motion. They kind of shuffle around, or they're very heavy in their movements as they age. And then the other extreme is that you get people who, thinking that it's not so good to be kind of restricted in their movement, stretch a lot, either through yoga or just stretching generally, are very flexible, but still they're not getting this elasticity. They've got this kind of loosey-goosey way of moving, and it's still really heavy, the way they move, and they still put a lot of pressure on their joints. But they can go through the ranges of motion that the people who are more chronically shortened and have bad posture, visibly very bad posture, they can go through ranges of motion that they can't, which many people think is an advantage, but as I've already explained, can be a big disadvantage when it comes to injury. And I'll do maybe a Healthcast on that, on some of the issues to think about when it comes to injury, flexibility and posture. But that's something to think about. Load the muscle, release it. And again, if I use the example of couple of examples. Again, the slam would be a good one to use. It's a nice simple exercise. Everyone's going to get it. As you bring the load back here, as you bend the knees and you hold a good postural position, you're going to create length here, and then you're going to slam. You're going to shorten off that length. And then if you're again, we kind of do the opposite exercise and jump from here, you can see that in this position, I'm going to put the length now on the back line, and then I'm going to contract the back line, and that's what's going to help me jump up. And again, we're going through a gait. If you're going to sprint, for example, we're going to create length here. Maybe we'll also create a little bit of length here, and we're going to contract there, we're going to contract there, and then we're also going to contract there at the same time in our gait. And so we're going to create length, contract, and this is going on also on the back line. So once in this position, we're going to pulling forward here, but also we're creating length here, and then we're contracting there as it pulls through. So there's all sorts of lengthening and shortening relationships going on simultaneously. Or spiral lines, lateral lines, front line, back line, they're all going on simultaneously, particularly when you do something like a sprint, for example. And that's why it looks bouncy and efficient. And when you lose that ability to lengthen and contract, it doesn't look so bouncy and efficient, and you can't sprint. So that would be the concept of priming, which is of super importance when you're trying to train how to move efficiently. Okay, finally then, on this little introduction to biomechanics, I'm going to put a little equation up on the screen. So I'm just going to read this off of a blog I did a little while ago. And so this is basically the principles of how you improve your biomechanics. So how you improve the efficiency of your movement. So the whole point of what everything I do is to try and improve biomechanics, to improve efficiency, so therefore you reduce your injury risk and you increase performance. So this is what I mean by the equation. So if you want to improve your biomechanics, this is what you need to do. So the effect or the amount of corrective exercises. So this is the exercises that you are doing to consciously improve your posture and improve your movement. And if you add that to MFR, so that's myofascial release, which if you don't already know from other videos, is the process of massage. So either by someone else or by yourself. So the effect of the amount of corrective exercise plus MFR, if that is greater than the tension created by poor posture that you already have, inactivity or other forms of exercise or activity, or stress or whatever it is, then you get an improvement in biomechanics. So what you shouldn't confuse here is that some people say, well, I work all day, for example, I'm working on a computer all day, so they may spend 7 or 8 hours at a desk all day. Does that mean I have to then spend 7 or 8 hours doing postural exercises to correct the problems I'm going to have? It's not quite as simple as that, but it's also not as depressing as that. So if you're sitting at a desk all day and you're kind of in this sort of position, you are stressed. There's mental stress which turns into physical stress, which then causes some sort of adaptation, and it's an adaptation that you don't want. But the physical stress isn't huge. Now, if you do the simple wall breathing exercise that I show in some other videos, even the simple exercises, the ones that are static, or even some of the simple movement exercises, are far more stressful, you could say, on the body than just sitting at a desk. So you're not going to need to do as many of them. The intensity of them is much, much higher than sitting at a desk. However, if you go and, let's say you go and do some weight training, or you play a sport, maybe you play football for the weekend, and you're not really thinking about your posture, and you play 90 minutes of football running around with bad gait, bad posture, or you're bench pressing with heavy weights, then yeah, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have a problem being able to improve your biomechanics if you're doing lots of fairly intense physical activity with bad posture and bad movement. Okay, the next part of it then is deterioration in biomechanics, and this is where most people are at. Most people are deteriorating, their posture's deteriorating, their movement's deteriorating as they age. So the effect of corrective exercise and MFR, maybe you're not doing any of it at all. If that is less than the tension created or the stress created by poor posture, inactivity and other forms of exercise, then you'll get a deterioration in biomechanics. So it says the exact opposite. And then number 3 is if the effect of the corrective exercise you do plus the MFR is equal to the tension created by poor posture, inactivity, other forms of exercise, then you'll see no change in the efficiency of your biomechanics and no change in your posture. So yeah, you can't expect to do a few exercises every now and then, go out and do all the activities that you were doing and all the lifestyle habits that you did have and expect to make meaningful changes. You may cause a slowing of the deterioration or you may cause a halting of the deterioration, but fundamentally to make big changes in the efficiency of your biomechanics, you're going to have to make some sacrifices in some areas and you're going to have to elevate what you're doing to try and change things. It's really as simple as that. And this is a real kicker for most people, because people are wedded to things that they really enjoy. That maybe their social life revolves around a sport they play, and even if you know what you're doing, as far as, and I'll give an example for me with this one, with squash and cricket, for example, my two sports that I tend to play the most, or I did tend to play the most. There's just no way that you can really focus on what you're doing in a game of squash or in a game of cricket and then focus on doing everything in the correct technique at the same time. In cricket it may be a little bit easier, but in squash, for example, there's just no way to play a game of squash that respects biomechanics and to be able to do it in the right way. For a start, you heel strike every time you stretch out and hit a ball, and that just wouldn't happen if I was following the kind of protocols that I would follow. So unfortunately, if you want to make improvements, there's going to have to be sacrifices that you're going to make, and some people are not prepared to make those, some people are. If you don't make them, you probably won't see that much improvement. Right then, so something to note then, finally, about this equation. So some of you may have been able to figure out the big problem here. So I'm talking about sacrifices that you may need to make, but think, everything that you do where you're not really focusing on where you're at with your posture and how you're moving, everything that you do is going to basically cause you to spiral into the postural position that you don't want. So it's the postural position that you're getting into. So again, most people are slightly rounded, they may be dipped on one shoulder, and so eventually if we wind the clock forward to 100 years old, you're going to be going this way. And so literally everything you do will cause this problem. So the way you're standing, the way you're walking, maybe you walk the dog, you're going to reinforce this drift into bad posture. And so if you play football, you play cricket, you do the cooking, maybe you put all your weight on one leg when you're doing the cooking, and then you do something like that when you're doing the cooking. So everything is going to go that way. So how do we make sure that if you really do want to improve your posture, you're going the right way, you're getting enough corrective forces to drive an improvement in your movement efficiency and your posture? Well, you've got to think about it a fair bit, unfortunately. So yes, the intensity of the exercises, particularly as you're working against your body in many cases, you're working against the shortening of some muscles, is going to be high. And so doing a lot of the corrective exercises is going to be useful, but also it's important to think about how you're holding yourself in space most of the time. So again, if you go out for a walk, so I walk my daughter quite a lot outside, I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about what I'm doing with my shoulders and my stomach and the tilt of my pelvis. Now, you can get really obsessive about it and you could kind of stress yourself out with it, but just kind of half think about it, at least, if you can. If you can just get into the habit of half thinking about it and doing a little bit, it will make a big difference. And so it's going down a bit of a rabbit hole of what you need to do to change things, and you have to kind of think of how much you want it. And so for most people, it's not enough, and they'll just say, "I'll forget about it. I'm just going to carry on, do the things that I enjoy, improve." And if I worry about biomechanics too much, it's just going to be too much or too busy. But for many people, there's no choice, and you might find as well that in the future that you have no choice, that a lot of the things that you love doing are going to be taken away from you anyway in time, and that if you actually get on board with trying to fix it, then you may be able to compromise at some point and continue being able to enjoy your life physically, instead of ending up in the inevitable cycle of deterioration that most people have. And it tends to go something like this. For men in particular, as I'm a man, I'm going to go from a kind of quite male perspective, but you might get heavily into sport, play sport when you're younger, make friends, socialise in sport, then you start to get injuries and you can't do sport anymore, so you might take up a bit of running, and then you get injuries and you can't run anymore, so you take up cycling, then you get injuries and cycling is causing you pain, so then you stop cycling. Then you might maybe just go to the gym. Then you get injuries. Then you stop going to the gym, and then you do nothing. And then more problems come as you become inactive, and then you die. It's really, I know that's a slightly depressing way to end this video, but it doesn't have to be that way. You can make changes, but it does take some sacrifices and some fairly deep thinking and habits changed to be able to do it. But I hope that's given a reasonable overview into how I think about biomechanics, and please leave any comments if you're interested, and I'll see you next time.